blood stained the frost of the Blackwood border, not from a rival pack, but from the king's own elite guard. They were slaughtered by a fragile Omega. Now, King Gideon Cross doesn't want her executed. He wants the girl who broke his army brought to his throne breathing. The village of Oakhaven was little more than a collection of rotting timber and desperate prayers, buried under the relentless snows of the northern reach. For decades, the hierarchy of the lycanthrope world had been carved in stone and enforced by blood. Alphas ruled, betas served, and Omegas survived at the absolute mercy of the pack. Sylvie Blanchard was an Omega. By the laws of King Gideon's realm, she was effectively property assigned to scrub the blood-stained floors of the village abattoir and subsist on the scraps left behind by the hunters. She was small, quiet, and possessed a scent so muted that most wolves barely registered her presence. But beneath her submissive posture and the ragged wool of her cloak, a quiet, terrifying storm had been brewing for 22 years. The catalyst arrived on the coldest morning of November. Captain Henrik, a high-ranking alpha of the King's vanguard, rode into Oakhaven with a dozen heavily armored enforcers. They were there to collect the winter tithe, a cruel taxation of cured meats, furs, and conscripts that left the lower villages starving. Henrik was a cruel man, deeply scarred from border skirmishes, who believed fear was the only language the lower classes understood. "The quota is short," Henrik sneered, his heavy boots crunching against the hard-packed ice of the village square. He dropped a meager sack of salted venison into the mud. "King Gideon demands his due. If the storehouses are empty, we take payment in flesh." Sylvie watched from the shadows of the abattoir, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She gripped the rough handle of her scrubbing brush until her knuckles turned white. Beside her stood her younger brother, Leo. Unlike Sylvie, Leo was an unpresented juvenile, but he was sickly. A winter march to the capital's labor camps would kill him before they even cleared the forest. Henrik's golden eyes scanned the terrified crowd of villagers until they landed on the trembling boy. "That one!" Henrik barked, pointing a gauntleted finger at Leo. "Strip him! Throw him in the cart!" Two vanguard brutes lunged forward. They didn't even bother to shift into their wolf forms. The sheer physical dominance of an alpha in human skin was usually enough. They grabbed Leo by his ragged collar, tossing him roughly into the freezing mud. Something inside Sylvie fractured. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a primal, ancient instinct that bypassed the heavily conditioned submission of her caste. The history books in the King's library claimed Omegas were naturally weak, bred only for pacification and servitude. They lied. Centuries ago, before the Alpha bloodlines rewrote history, Omegas were the fiercely protective heart of the pack, possessing a lethal, defensive rage designed to protect the vulnerable when the Alphas were away at war. That forgotten lineage woke up. "Let him go!" Sylvie's voice rang out. It wasn't a plea. It was a low, resonant command that made the frozen air vibrate. Captain Henrik paused, turning slowly. He let out a harsh bark of laughter. "An Omega speaks. Put her on her knees and take her tongue." The closest guard reached for his silver-hilted blade, stepping toward Sylvie with a malicious grin. He never completed the draw. Sylvie moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics. She didn't shift into a wolf. Shifting took seconds, and she didn't have the luxury of time. Instead, she let the wolf's power flood her human form. Her fingernails elongated into jagged, bone-white talons. Her hazel eyes flared into a blinding, luminescent silver. She ducked beneath the guard's grasping hand, her arm shooting upward in a devastating arc. Her claws tore through the chainmail at his throat as if it were wet parchment. The man collapsed, a gurgling sound escaping his ruined windpipe, his blood melting the snow in a steaming scarlet pool. Silence slammed into the courtyard. The villagers froze. The vanguard stared, paralyzed by the impossible geometry of what they had just witnessed. An Omega had just killed a fully trained Alpha Enforcer in less than a second. "Kill her!" Henrik roared, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. "Tear her apart!" 6 of the vanguard shifted instantly, the sounds of snapping bones and tearing fabric echoing through the square as massive, muscle-bound wolves lunged at the petite girl. It was a massacre, but not the one Henrik anticipated. Sylvie was a blur of silver-eyed violence. She fought with a feral, unpredictable fluidity, using their massive size and aggression against them. When a grey wolf lunged for her shoulder, she dropped to her knees, driving a scavenged iron butchering hook straight up into its chest cavity. She vaulted off the dying creature, twisting mid-air to deliver a bone-shattering kick to the jaw of another. She was fighting with a desperate, unhinged savagery. She wasn't just defending herself. She was punishing them for a lifetime of degradation. She broke limbs, severed arteries, and crushed windpipes. Within 3 minutes, 6 of the king's most elite warriors lay dead or dying in the mud. Henrik, realizing the catastrophic reality of the situation, did the unthinkable for an Alpha. He ran. He scrambled onto his massive warhorse, leaving his surviving, terrified men to cover his retreat. Sylvie stood amidst the carnage, chest heaving, covered head to toe in Alpha blood. The silver light slowly faded from her eyes, leaving her staring at her trembling, blood-soaked Hans. The village was completely silent, staring at her not with gratitude, but with absolute, paralyzing terror. She knew the laws. She had just declared war on the king. Grabbing Leo's hand, she ran into the blinding white of the Blackwood Forest. The Great Hall of Ironhold was a masterpiece of intimidating architecture. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into the shadows, and banners of midnight blue and silver hung from massive stone pillars. King Gideon Cross sat upon the obsidian throne, a man forged from ruthless pragmatism and battlefield strategy. He was a terrifying ruler, broad-shouldered and imposing, with piercing ice-blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. When Captain Henrik was dragged into the throne room 3 days later, frostbitten, exhausted, and humiliated, the king's court fell completely silent. "You lost 6 of my vanguard," Gideon stated, his voice a dangerously soft rumble that carried to the farthest corners of the hall. 6 elite soldiers, and you tell me it was a rogue pack. Henrik fell to his knees, his pride entirely shattered. "No, my king. It was an Omega, a girl from the Oakhaven abattoir. She moved like a demon. She ripped Silas's throat out with her bare hands. She broke Constance's spine." Murmurs of disbelief and outrage erupted among the council members. Elder Corbin, a withered but deeply influential Alpha who managed the kingdom's laws, stepped forward, slamming his staff against the stone floor, lies to cover his own incompetence. Corbin spat. "An Omega is biologically incapable of overpowering an Alpha, let alone 6. The girl must have used dark magic or poison. Regardless, this is an act of high treason. Send a regiment. Burn Oakhaven to the ground and bring me the girl's head on a pike to restore order." Gideon held up a single, heavily scarred hand. The room fell dead silent again. The king leaned forward, resting his chin on his knuckles. He wasn't looking at Corbin. He was staring intently at Henrik. "Did she shift?" Gideon asked quietly. "No, sire," Henrik whispered, trembling. "She fought in her human skin, but her eyes, they burned silver." Gideon's breath hitched, an almost imperceptible reaction that only his closest generals would have noticed. Silver eyes. The old texts he had secretly studied in his youth texts, deemed heretical by the elders, spoke of an ancient lineage, the Aegis Omegas, the true protectors of the Pax, hunted to near extinction by power-hungry Alphas centuries ago because their defensive power rivaled an Alpha's offensive might. If this girl was a descendant, she was the most dangerous and potentially the most valuable asset in his kingdom. "Captain Henrik," Gideon said, his voice turning to ice, "you abandoned your men to die at the hands of a servant. You are stripped of your rank and banished from Ironhold." As guards dragged the screaming Henrik away, Gideon stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the council. "There will be no regiment sent to burn Oakhaven," Gideon commanded, his tone leaving no room for debate. "And the girl's head will remain firmly attached to her shoulders." Elder Corbin's jaw dropped. "Your Majesty, she murdered our finest. She undermines the very foundation of our hierarchy. If the lower castes hear of this, they will hear that their king dealt with the anomaly himself." Gideon interrupted, stepping down from the dais. "Prepare my hunting gear. Ready my horse. I am leaving within the hour." "You are sending a tracker?" Corbin asked, confused. "No," Gideon said, unfastening his velvet cloak and tossing it to a servant. "I am going into the Blackwood. I will track her myself." "But sire, what is your order regarding the traitor?" Gideon paused at the heavy oak doors of the hall, looking back over his shoulder. A strange, unfamiliar spark ignited in his chest, a mixture of predatory instinct and intense, consuming curiosity. "The Omega took down half my warriors," Gideon said, a dark smirk playing on his lips. "I want to look her in the eyes. The decree is absolute. She is to be captured. Anyone who harms a single hair on her head will answer to my claws. Bring her to me, alive." For 5 brutal days and nights, Gideon tracked her. The Blackwood was a labyrinth of frozen pines and deadly ravines, but Gideon was an apex predator. He found the signs the vanguard had missed, a snapped twig covered in frost, the faint, metallic scent of dried blood on a tree trunk, the meticulously hidden depressions in the snow where she had carried her brother. What fascinated him most was her strategy. She wasn't running blindly. She was using the terrain. She doubled back, walked through icy streams to hide her scent, and set crude but highly effective deadfall traps that nearly caught 2 of Gideon's royal trackers. She was brilliant. On the evening of the 6th day, the blizzard finally broke, leaving a haunting, moonlit silence over the forest. Gideon had left his retinue a mile back, proceeding entirely alone. He wanted no interference. He crested a snowy ridge and finally caught it. Her scent. It hit him with the force of a physical blow. Omegas were supposed to smell sickeningly sweet, like crushed sugar and wilting flowers, a scent designed to pacify. But the scent drifting on the icy wind was different. It smelled like impending storms, ozone, crushed pine needles, and something ancient and intoxicating. It made Gideon's wolf thrash against his ribcage, howling not for blood, but for her. He dropped silently into the ravine below, moving with the stealth of a shadow. He found her backed against a sheer rock face. She had tucked the shivering boy, Leo, into a small crevice behind her, shielding him with her own body. She was exhausted. Her clothes were torn, her lips were blue with cold, and she was gripping a stolen, blood-stained vanguard sword with shaking hands. Gideon stepped out of the tree line, making no sudden movements. He let his towering, 6'4" frame stand fully upright in the moonlight, making his identity incredibly clear. Sylvie's head snapped toward him. She didn't cower. She didn't drop to her knees and expose her neck as a lesser wolf should in the presence of the Alpha King. Instead, she tightened her grip on the sword, pushed herself off the rock wall, and stepped directly between the king and her brother. "Take another step," Sylvie rasped, her voice raw and ruined from the cold, "and I will do to you exactly what I did to your men." Gideon stopped. He looked at the fragile, freezing girl threatening the most powerful alpha in the continent. Slowly, deliberately. The Alpha King smiled. He didn't see a criminal. He saw a queen. The standoff in the freezing ravine stretched into an eternity of suspended breath. King Gideon Cross, a warlord whose very name sent rival packs fleeing into the mountains, stood perfectly still before a starving, battered Omega. He didn't draw his own broadsword. He didn't let his eyes flash with Alpha command. Instead, he unclasped the heavy, fur-lined mantle from his broad shoulders and let it fall to the snow. He unbuckled his weapon belt, the heavy silver buckles clanking loudly against the ice, and kicked it away. "I am not here to hurt you." "Sylvie," Gideon said, his voice dropping into a low, soothing register that hummed right through her boots. He knew her name. He had spent the last 5 days tearing through the registry of Oakhaven to find out exactly who this impossible girl was. "You're the king," Sylvie rasped, her hands shaking violently from exhaustion, the heavy vanguard sword wavering in her grip. "You came to execute me for the blood I spilled. If I wanted you dead, my tracker hounds would have found you 3 days ago, and I would have sent an executioner." Gideon replied softly, taking a single, slow step forward. "I came myself because I needed to see if the rumors were true. You are freezing. Your brother's lips are blue. If you stay in this ravine, the winter will kill you both before sunrise. Come with me." Sylvie's silver eyes flickered, the ancient defensive magic warring with her desperate, human exhaustion. She looked back at Leo, who had slumped against the jagged rock face, completely unconscious, his breath coming in shallow, icy rattles. The fight drained out of her all at once. The sword slipped from her numb fingers, clattering against the stone. Gideon closed the distance instantly. He didn't grab her with the rough dominance of a conqueror. He picked up his discarded mantle and wrapped it tightly around her trembling shoulders. The heavy, residual heat of his body immediately enveloping her in a cocoon of warmth and the intoxicating scent of cedar, smoke, and pure power. He then scooped the unconscious Leo into his arms with startling gentleness, treating the fragile boy as if he weighed nothing more than a bundle of dry reeds. "Walk in my footsteps," the king commanded gently. "It will save your strength." The journey back to Ironhold was a blur of exhaustion. When they finally crossed the iron-wrought gates of the capital, the fortress was waiting. Hundreds of courtiers, generals, and servants lined the courtyards, expecting to see the rogue Omega dragged behind the king's warhorse in chains. Instead, a collective, stunned silence swept through the keep as King Gideon rode in, holding the bruised, dirt-streaked Omega securely against his chest, with the sick boy draped across the saddle in front of them. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Lord Reginald Harrington, a wealthy aristocrat who held immense sway over the kingdom's grain supply, stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Your Majesty," Lord Harrington barked, flanked by his personal guard. "You bring the murderer into the inner keep. The dungeons are for traitors." "Harrington!" Gideon snarled, a visceral, terrifying rumble tearing from his chest that made the nobleman stumble backward in pure terror. "This girl and her brother are under my personal protection. Prepare the royal physician immediately. If the boy perishes, I will hold the medical staff personally responsible." Sylvie was ushered not into a cell, but into the sprawling, opulent suites of the king's private wing. Dr. Arthur Pendleton, the finest healer in the realm, was dragged from his bed to pump Leo full of potent wolfsbane-laced antibiotics and hot, restorative broths. For 2 days. Sylvie refused to speak. She sat like a stone gargoyle in the velvet-lined armchair beside Leo's massive mahogany bed, watching the door, refusing the decadent meals brought by terrified servants. She was a prisoner of luxury, but she knew a cage was still a cage, no matter how gilded the bars. On the 3rd night, the heavy oak door swung open, and Gideon entered. He had shed his armor, wearing only a loose linen shirt and dark trousers, making him look less like a warlord and more like a devastatingly handsome, dangerous man. He carried a silver tray holding 2 steaming cups of spiced tea and a plate of roasted meats. He didn't ask for permission. He pulled a chair to the opposite side of the crackling fireplace and set the tray down. "He's breathing easily now," Gideon noted, glancing at Leo's sleeping form. "Doctor, Pendleton assures me the infection has passed. He will be strong enough to walk the gardens by the week's end." Sylvie stared at the flames, pulling the silk dressing gown tighter around herself. "Why are you doing this? I slaughtered 6 of your finest soldiers. By your own laws, I should have been flayed alive in the village square." Gideon leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because the laws are built on a lie, Sylvie, and you just proved it." Sylvie's brow furrowed. She finally looked at him, her hazel eyes guarded. "I don't understand. When my ancestors conquered this continent, they wrote the history books," Gideon explained, his gaze locked intensely onto hers. "They taught that alphas were the absolute rulers, betas were the soldiers, and omegas were weak, subservient creatures meant only for breeding and servitude. It kept the power concentrated, but long before the cross bloodline took the throne, there were the Aegis." He stood up, walking to a massive bookshelf, and pulled down a crumbling, leather-bound tome. He set it on the table between them. The Aegis were a rare, sacred class of omegas, Gideon murmured, his voice thick with reverence. They possessed a dormant defensive magic, triggered only by the deepest need to protect the vulnerable. When their packs were threatened, their eyes would turn silver, and they became unstoppable. They could shatter stone, outmaneuver the fastest alphas, and endure lethal blows. My ancestors hunted them to near extinction because they feared a power they could not control. Sylvie stared at the faded sketches in the book. A woman with blazing eyes standing over a fallen child, surrounded by wolves. It was exactly what had happened in the courtyard. "I am not a myth," Sylvie whispered, her voice trembling. "I am just a girl who wanted to save her brother." "You are an Aegis," Gideon corrected, stepping closer until his heat radiated against her skin. "And you are the first to awaken in 300 years. You tore through my men because they broke the fundamental law of the pack they preyed on the weak. You did exactly what you were born to do." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The contact sent a violent, electric shock through them both. Sylvie gasped, her heart slamming against her ribs as the unmistakable, intoxicating scent of pine and ozone flooded the room. The mating bond. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was the ancient magic of their bloodlines recognizing their exact equal, the most powerful alpha in the world, and the only omega capable of bringing him to his knees. The revelation of her true nature didn't bring peace, it brought absolute chaos. While Gideon spent his nights locked in quiet, intense conversation with Sylvie, slowly earning her trust and exploring the terrifying, electric pull between them. The court was boiling over with treason. Elder Corbin had not been idle. The old Alpha had spent decades manipulating the caste system to gorge his own coffers, and the idea of a peasant Omega sleeping in the king's wing threatened to unravel his entire empire. He began holding secret meetings in the crypts beneath Ironhold, rallying purist noblemen and disgraced generals. "The king is bewitched," Corbin hissed to his co-conspirators, his eyes cold and venomous. "He intends to rewrite the laws, to elevate the Dirt Eaters to our level. We cannot allow an Omega to sit on the Obsidian throne. She must be eradicated. And if the king stands in the way, he falls with her." The climax arrived on the night of the winter solstice, the most sacred festival in the lycanthrope calendar. The great hall was transformed into a glittering sea of ice sculptures, crystal chandeliers, and roaring hearths. The entire aristocracy was in attendance, dressed in silks and heavy furs. Gideon had insisted Sylvie attend. He had dressed her not as a servant, but as a queen. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue velvet, embroidered with silver threads that caught the light with every step. When Gideon led her down the grand staircase, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, the music abruptly stopped. The silence in the hall was deafening. The sheer audacity of the king, parading an Omega murderer before the High Court, was a slap in the face to every nobleman present. But beneath the outrage, there was a palpable, terrified awe. Sylvie didn't walk with her head bowed. She walked with the quiet, lethal grace of a predator, her chin held high, the scent of the king woven seamlessly with her own storm-like aura. They took their places at the high table, but the tension in the room was thicker than the winter frost outside. It happened during the third course. A group of servers approached the high table, bearing massive silver platters of roasted boar. But as they drew near, the scent in the room shifted violently. Sylvie's heightened senses caught it a fraction of a second before Gideon did the bitter, metallic tang of rusted iron and sour sweat. "Gideon, down!" Sylvie screamed. She didn't wait for him to react. The ancient magic flared, her eyes igniting into a blinding, incandescent silver. She vaulted over the heavy oak table just as the servers threw off their cloaks, revealing the hardened, scarred faces of rogue mercenaries armed with poisoned silver crossbows. Elder Corbin stood from his seat across the room, roaring the command. "Kill the beast!" A volley of silver bolts tore through the air, aimed directly at Gideon's chest, but Sylvie was already there. She moved with blinding speed, intercepting the projectiles. With a sweeping motion of her velvet-clad arm, she shattered the wooden shafts mid-air, the silver arrowheads clattering harmlessly against the stone floor. Panic erupted. Courtiers screamed and scrambled for the exits as a dozen heavily armed assassins flooded the high dais. Gideon roared, shifting instantly into his monstrous, pitch-black wolf form. He was a nightmare of muscle and teeth, tearing into the nearest assassins with brutal, merciless efficiency. But there were too many, and they were armed with heavy, silver-laced nets designed to subdue an alpha. Two mercenaries managed to throw a weighted net over Gideon, pinning the massive wolf to the ground. A third raised a heavy broadsword, aiming directly for the back of the king's neck. He never made the strike. Sylvie lunged, her velvet dress tearing as she closed the distance. She didn't have a weapon. She was the weapon. She grabbed the mercenary by his armored breastplate and hurled him effortlessly across the room, smashing him into an ice sculpture with bone-crushing force. Another assassin swung a silver mace at her head. Sylvie caught the heavy iron head with her bare hand. The metal hissed and burned against her skin, but she didn't even flinch. Her silver eyes locked onto the terrified man's face before she twisted her wrist, snapping the handle of the mace and driving her palm upward into his jaw, dropping him instantly. She stood over the trapped king, a small, beautiful girl in a ruined dress, surrounded by broken bodies. She let out a sound that chilled the blood of every person in the hall, a low, resonant, vibrating growl that shook the very foundation of the fortress. It was an absolute demand for submission. The remaining assassins dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, weeping in pure terror. The power of the Aegis was absolute. Gideon ripped through the silver net, shifting back into his human form. He was bleeding from several deep cuts, his chest heaving, but he didn't look at his wounds. He looked only at Sylvie. The hall was dead silent, save for the crackling fires and the groans of the dying. Elder Corbin, realizing his coup had failed catastrophically, tried to slip out the side door. "Stop him!" Gideon commanded. Two loyal guards immediately slammed Corbin to the ground, binding his hands. Gideon walked slowly across the blood-slicked floor, ignoring the horrified stares of his aristocracy. He stopped in front of Sylvie. The silver light in her eyes was slowly fading back to Hazel, leaving her gasping for breath, trembling as the adrenaline crashed. Gideon didn't care about the blood on her hands or the terrified lords watching them. He dropped to one knee right there in the wreckage of the great hall, taking her bruised, burned hands in his. For centuries, my ancestors ruled through fear and suppression. Gideon's voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings, loud enough for every cowering noble to hear. They built a kingdom on the lie that alphas were the only strength of a pack. Today, an Omega saved the king. Today, the old laws burn. He looked up into Sylvie's eyes, the fierce, undeniable mating bond snapping into place with absolute finality. "Let the council hear my decree," Gideon roared, standing up and pulling Sylvie flush against his side. "Elder Corbin is sentenced to the block for high treason. The caste laws are officially abolished, and the girl who broke my army will not be a prisoner. She is my mate, my equal, and the absolute queen of this realm." Sylvie looked at the towering, terrifying king, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to survive him. She reached up, cupping his scarred cheek, and smiled as the kingdom fell to its knees before the Aegis Queen. Did the explosive tension between King Gideon and Sylvie keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved this fierce, rule-breaking werewolf romance and want to see more epic tales of underdogs taking the throne, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your fellow fantasy lovers and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, heart-pounding audio dramas every single week.